Daniel Carter stood in his office on the 87th floor and looked at the screens around him. Each screen showed the same terrible news. The Horizon Initiative was dying in space. 2,000 people were trapped inside with no way out. Every smart person he hired told him the same thing. Nobody could fix it. Nobody could reach them in time. The ship was 3 light years away from Earth and the main reactor was dead. Life support systems were failing. The colonists had maybe 3 weeks before the air ran out. Daniel had built a company worth $600 billion. He owned the biggest private space fleet in history. He had changed technology forever with his inventions. But right now, none of that mattered. He could not save those people. The best minds in the world worked on this problem for 3 days. They all came back with the same answer: impossible. His assistant called through the intercom and asked about the board meeting. Daniel told her to cancel everything. He sat down in his chair and felt empty inside. Outside his window, the city of New Chicago stretched far into the distance. All those buildings and lights and people living their lives. Meanwhile, 2,000 humans were dying in the cold darkness of space, and he could do nothing. The door opened behind him. Daniel turned and saw Marcus Webb coming in with his cleaning cart. Marcus was the night janitor. He looked about 60 years old with dark skin and gray hair. He wore the standard gray uniform that all maintenance workers wore. His movements were smooth and efficient, like someone who had done this job for many years. Daniel said he was not in the mood for company tonight. Marcus said he understood and started emptying the trash bins. He asked if Daniel had a rough day at the office. Daniel laughed without humor and said 2,000 people were going to die, and there was nothing he could do. Marcus stopped working and asked if he meant the colony ship. Daniel asked if he followed the news. Marcus said his daughter worked at the communications center and monitored the transmissions, so everyone was talking about it. Daniel walked to the window and explained that the main reactor was offline and backup systems were failing. Even his fastest ship would take 14 months to reach them. They only had 3 or 4 weeks left. Marcus said quietly that it seemed like a puzzle. Daniel spun around angry and said this was not some riddle. Real people were dying out there. Marcus looked at him calmly and said he meant no disrespect. He just meant that sometimes when you cannot go through a problem, you have to go around it. Daniel repeated the word sarcastically. Around it, why did he not think of that? Oh wait, he did, along with 50 other experts who worked on this problem for 3 days straight. Marcus nodded slowly and started pushing his cart toward the door. He said Daniel knew best and he would get out of his way. As the janitor reached the door, something caught in Daniel's mind. Marcus had not seemed upset or scared. There was something in his voice that bothered Daniel's pride. A quiet certainty. Daniel called out and told him to wait. He asked what Marcus meant by going around it. Marcus turned back and asked if he could ask a question first. Daniel told him to go ahead. Marcus asked why he needed to reach the ship. Daniel stared at him and said to fix the reactor and save the colonists. Marcus said the reactor was the problem, so maybe the reactor was not the solution. Daniel felt frustration rising again. He told Marcus that he appreciated the help, but this was complex engineering. The reactor powered everything: life support and navigation and communications and environmental systems. Without it, they had nothing. Marcus said quietly that they had something. They had 2,000 people, 2,000 minds, 2,000 pairs of hands. He paused and added that they also had Daniel. Daniel sat down slowly. His anger faded into curiosity. He asked what exactly Marcus was suggesting. Marcus wheeled his cart closer and pulled out a small tablet from his uniform pocket. He asked if he could use the desk console. Daniel nodded and Marcus connected his tablet to the holographic display. The dead colony ship appeared in the air between them. Marcus pointed at the main reactor compartment and said everyone was focused on this. The big solution, the one thing that fixes everything. He zoomed out to show the entire ship and asked what if they looked at it differently. What if instead of one big solution they found 1,000 small ones? Daniel said he did not follow. Marcus smiled and said, "Let me tell you a story." 20 years ago, Marcus worked construction on a big building project in Africa. During the final phase, the main power line failed. It could not be replaced without tearing out 6 months of work. Daniel asked what they did. Marcus explained that the foreman wanted to bring in specialists and spend millions of dollars and months of time. But one of the local workers suggested something crazy. Instead of replacing the one big power line, they ran 200 smaller ones. They used existing pathways and ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels. It took 300 workers, but they had power restored in 4 days instead of 4 months. Daniel leaned forward and said Marcus was suggesting they bypass the main reactor entirely. Marcus said more than that. He started pointing at different parts of the ship display. Look here, he said. The ship has emergency batteries in every living module, 24 hours of backup power each. There are solar panels on the outside that are folded up because the navigation systems went down. There is even a small generator in the medical bay that nobody thinks about because it is designed for surgery, not life support. He highlighted systems all throughout the ship. 2,000 colonists, and most of them have skills. Engineers and technicians and doctors and teachers. What if you organize them? Had them take apart non-essential systems and reroute power through makeshift connections. Create a distributed network instead of one central system. Daniel's mind raced as he saw possibilities he had been blind to before. His whole approach had been top-down, finding one perfect solution. But Marcus was suggesting something different. Organize chaos. Many small solutions working together. Daniel said suddenly that the communications array could send data even if they could not send ships. Detailed instructions and engineering plans and step-by-step procedures. Marcus grinned and said, "Now you are thinking." Daniel started pacing and said, coordinating that many people doing that many tasks at the same time would need a management system. Marcus corrected him gently and said they would need leaders on the ground. People the colonists trusted. You cannot manage this from Earth, he said. You have to empower them to manage themselves. Daniel stopped pacing and looked at Marcus with new respect. He asked how a janitor knew all this. Marcus chuckled and said he was a janitor now, but he was not always one. He did 20 years as a Navy engineering chief. He served on submarine crews where everything was about backup systems and creative solutions. After that, he worked civil engineering projects in 12 different countries. Life takes you places, he said with a shrug. The economy crashed and he got injured and had to find work that did not require climbing tall structures anymore. Daniel asked why he did not say something earlier. Why did he not apply for a position at Carter Technologies? Marcus said simply that he did. About 8 years ago, he got an automated rejection in 20 seconds. The algorithm decided a 60-year-old former engineer with a gap in his work history was not worth interviewing. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just facts. Daniel felt shame wash over him. His company prided itself on finding the best people, but they programmed their systems to overlook someone like Marcus because he did not fit the traditional profile. Daniel said quietly that he was sorry. Marcus replied that he should not be sorry. He should be better. Now was Daniel going to save those people or keep feeling guilty? Daniel laughed despite himself and said Marcus was right. He asked if Marcus would like a consulting position and to name his price. Marcus shook his head and said he did not need the money. What he needed was for Daniel to listen. The answer was not in hiring him. It was in changing how you see problems. You have thousands of brilliant people working for you, but you organize them like a pyramid with you at the top making all decisions. Sometimes the best solutions come from the bottom up, from the people doing the actual work. Daniel asked if Marcus would at least help him with this problem. Please. Marcus considered this and then nodded. He said he would help, but they were going to do this his way. Daniel cleared his desk with a hand gesture and the entire surface became a workspace. Marcus connected his tablet again and together they began planning. Something that would have seemed insane 6 hours. Ego Marcus said the first thing they needed to do was stop thinking like engineers and start thinking like people. What do those colonists need most right now? Daniel said immediately that they needed air. Life support was the critical system. Marcus said no. They needed hope. They needed to know someone was working on this and that they were not abandoned. Your communications with them so far have been all bad news, right? Daniel nodded reluctantly and said they had been honest about the situation. Marcus said honest was good, but hopeless was bad. When you reach out, you lead with the solution, not the problem. You tell them we have a plan, and here is what we are going to do together. He pulled up files showing all 2,000 colonists. Faces filled the display. Marcus asked who was in charge up there. Daniel said Captain Lisa Morgan, former Air Force with 20 years of command experience. She was good. Marcus said, then she is your partner, not your subordinate. You make her the hero of this story, not you. Because the truth is, she is the one who is going to save that ship. You are just giving her the tools. They worked through the night and Daniel found himself learning more from Marcus in a few hours than from months of business school. The janitor's approach was completely different from anything he had been taught. Where Daniel saw control and hierarchy, Marcus saw networks and collaboration. Where Daniel wanted efficiency, Marcus valued the ability to survive. Marcus highlighted a section of the ship showing the food-growing areas. The gardens had their own environmental controls and their own water systems. Right now, everyone thought of those as separate from the main living areas. But what if they were not? What if you turn those gardens into life support centers, close-off areas you do not need, and move the population into spaces that can sustain themselves independently? Daniel said Marcus was suggesting they turn the ship into a series of independent sections. Marcus said exactly. If one fails, the others survive. You are not saving 2,000 people as one group. You are saving 200 groups of 10, different mindset and different solutions. Daniel was taking notes frantically while his computer systems recorded everything. He said this would take incredible coordination. They would need team leaders and task assignments and resource planning. Marcus said gently that Daniel was doing it again. Top-down thinking. Let them organize themselves. You provide the framework and the knowledge, and they provide the adaptation and creativity. Trust them. At 3 a.m, Daniel's assistant Greg Hammond arrived after getting an urgent message. He stopped short when he saw the janitor working side by side with the boss. Daniel said to meet Marcus Webb, their new special consultant. He told Greg he was chief of operations and they needed to assemble a team. Pull in engineers and communications specialists and supply chain managers and psychologists. Greg asked why psychologists. Daniel explained that they were not just solving an engineering problem. They were coordinating 2,000 scared people in a crisis. They needed to understand the human element. Greg looked at Marcus with doubt and asked what exactly his qualifications were. Daniel said sharply that Marcus had saved more lives than Greg ever would. His qualifications were that he saw solutions where everyone else saw only problems. Now get moving, because they were on a clock. As Greg hurried out, Marcus smiled slightly and said Daniel did not have to defend him. Daniel said yes, he did, because Marcus was right. He had built this company on credentials and computer algorithms, and he had been blind to talent that did not fit his narrow definition. That changes now. By dawn, they had a plan. It was bold and maybe impossible, but it was something. Daniel stood in the communications center, surrounded by his hastily assembled team. Marcus stood beside him, looking uncomfortable in a borrowed suit that Daniel had insisted he wear. Beth Williams, who ran Deep Space Communications, said they were ready for transmission. She warned that the delay was 43 minutes each way. This would not be a conversation. Daniel said he understood and took a deep breath. He activated the recording and addressed Captain Morgan. By the time you receive this, you will have been running on backup systems for 72 hours. I know your situation seems impossible. I know you have been told there is no way to reach you in time. He paused to gather his thoughts and continued. But that was the wrong answer because we were asking the wrong question. We do not need to reach you because you already have everything you need. You have 2,000 brilliant, capable people. You have a ship full of systems that can be repurposed and rerouted and reimagined. And you have us ready to support you, with every piece of knowledge and expertise we can transmit. Marcus gave him an encouraging nod from the side. What I am sending with this transmission is a comprehensive plan developed by Marcus Webb. A man who understands that survival is not about one perfect solution. It is about 1,000 imperfect ones working together. We are going to help you turn the Horizon Initiative into a distributed network of independent systems. No single point of failure. Complete redundancy. Daniel outlined the plan in detail. Consolidating populations into sustainable areas. Taking apart non-essential systems for parts. Creating makeshift power networks. Establishing independent zones that could support themselves. This will not be easy, he continued. It is going to require every skill and every bit of knowledge and every ounce of determination your people have. But I have learned something tonight. The best solutions do not come from the top down. They come from people working together and adapting and improvising and surviving. He glanced at Marcus, who gave him a subtle gesture of approval. You are not victims waiting for rescue. You are pioneers. You are exactly the kind of people humanity sent to the stars because we knew you could handle the impossible. So, here is what we are going to do together. We are going to save the Horizon Initiative not by fixing what is broken, but by building something new, something better, something that proves human determination beats any machine. Daniel transmitted the complete technical specifications, and detailed procedures and organizational frameworks. Gigabytes of data, all compressed and prioritized for immediate use. We will be here every step of the way, he concluded, sending updates and answering questions and working through problems as they arise. But this is your mission now, your ship, your people, your survival. We are just giving you the tools. The rest is up to you. The transmission ended and the room fell silent. Then they waited. 86 minutes crawled by like hours. Every person in the room felt the tension. Finally, the response came through. Captain Morgan's face appeared on the screen. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were fierce with determination. She said they received the transmission and technical specifications. She would be honest. When they first started reading through the plan, half her officers thought Daniel had lost his mind. She smiled grimly. The other half thought it might just work. She was siding with the second group. They had already started implementing Phase 1, consolidating non-essential personnel into the garden modules. It was going to be tight quarters, but they could make it work. The camera moved to show the ship's bridge where crew members were working frantically. Morgan said she was organizing people into task forces based on the framework Daniel sent. Engineers working on power redistribution, life support specialists managing environmental systems, a civilian logistics team handling resource allocation. She looked directly into the camera and said she did not know who Marcus Webb was, but his plan was giving her people something they desperately needed, a sense of control. They were not just waiting to die anymore. They were fighting, and humans are very good at fighting. We will send progress updates every 12 hours, she continued. If we run into problems, we will let you know. But tell Mr. Webb thank you from all of us. We are going to make this work. The transmission ended and the room erupted in cheers. Daniel turned to Marcus, who looked embarrassed by all the attention. Marcus said not to look at him. This was just beginning. The hard part came next. The first crisis came 18 hours later. Captain Morgan's update arrived with panic in her voice. We have a problem with the water recycling in Section 3. The connections will not hold pressure when we try to link into the garden systems. We have lost containment twice, and we cannot afford to waste water. Daniel's team immediately went to work running simulations and calculations. After 30 minutes of increasingly complex proposals, Marcus asked a simple question. What are they using for connectors? Beth pulled up the specifications and said standard compression fittings rated for the ship's original plumbing system. Marcus asked about the garden systems. She said agricultural-grade flexible tubing with different diameter and different pressure ratings. Marcus nodded and said they were trying to fit square pegs in round holes. They did not need fancy engineering. They needed the equivalent of duct tape. He pulled up his tablet and explained. Look, on a ship that size, they have to have hull patch compound. That stuff sets like steel and creates an airtight seal. Tell them to wrap the connections with absorbent fabric and soak it in patch compound and let it cure for 4 hours. It is not pretty, but it will hold. The suggestion was so simple and so low-tech that several engineers looked doubtful. But Daniel trusted Marcus now. They transmitted the solution. 4.5 hours later, Morgan's response came through. Section 3 is holding pressure. Who knew the answer was basically space-age duct tape? Please thank Mr. Webb and tell him we owe him about 200 beers. The solutions kept coming, and Marcus's approach proved valuable again and again. When the solar panel deployment failed because automated systems were down, Marcus suggested using pressure from emergency escape hatches to manually push them open. When power distribution created failures, he recommended intentionally creating bottlenecks to isolate problems. Daniel observed on the third day that Marcus was thinking like someone who never had perfect equipment. Every solution assumed things were broken and worked from there. Marcus replied that things were always broken. Perfect systems fail perfectly. Messy systems adapt. By day 4, the Horizon Initiative was completely different. The elegant central power grid had been replaced by a chaotic web of interconnected but independent systems. The population lived in clusters, with each area self-sufficient but linked to neighbors for resource sharing. It looked like a disaster to any engineer trained in efficiency. It was also working. Captain Morgan reported status. Life support stable in all active areas. We have successfully consolidated into 12 primary zones, each capable of sustaining its current population independently for 30 days minimum. Power generation is running at 42% of original capacity, but distribution is actually more stable because we are not routing everything through damaged lines. She looked exhausted but triumphant. We have lost some of the ship. Sections we had to seal off because they were not sustainable. But we have not lost any people. Not one. We are going to make it. The room erupted in celebration, but Marcus remained quiet. Daniel noticed his concerned expression and asked what was wrong. This was good news. Marcus agreed it was, but said they were not safe yet. They had bought themselves time, maybe a couple months if they were careful. But that ship was designed for a journey to a colony world. They could not stay in this configuration forever. Daniel felt his excitement fade and said Marcus was right. They needed a long-term solution. Marcus said more than that. They needed to change the mission. The Horizon could not reach its original destination anymore. Too much damage and too many compromised systems. But maybe it did not have to. He pulled up a map of the stars. The original colony target was New Geneva, 4 light-years away. That was a 5-year journey with a fully functional ship. Now it was impossible. He zoomed in on a different system and said, but this here is Kepler 442b, 2.3 light-years from their current position. It has a stable star and potentially livable conditions. The initial surveys marked it as a secondary colony site because it has higher gravity and a thinner atmosphere. Not ideal, but survivable. Daniel said Marcus wanted them to change course. The navigation systems were damaged. Marcus interrupted and said he knew, but they were not destroyed. They had manual controls and backup guidance systems. It would not be pretty, but it was possible. And here is the thing, he continued. Those people up there just proved they can adapt. They can survive in less than ideal conditions. Maybe that makes them perfect for a world that needs adapting to, rather than one that is already perfect. Daniel looked at the map, seeing not just a different destination, but a different future. He said this was not what they signed up for. Marcus agreed. They signed up for a 5-year trip to paradise. Instead, they got disaster and struggle and a chance to build something from nothing. That is not what they expected. It might be something better. Over the next 6 hours, Daniel's team evaluated the proposal. The numbers were challenging, but not impossible. Kepler 442b was reachable. It would take 3 years instead of the original 5 to New Geneva, but with their current setup, they could make it. The planet itself presented difficulties. Higher gravity meant stronger bones and harder physical labor. Thinner atmosphere required enclosed habitats initially, but it was survivable. Finally, Daniel prepared another transmission. He told Captain Morgan he was sending data on an alternative destination. Kepler 442b. It is closer and reachable with your current capabilities, but it is not the paradise world you were promised. It is harder, rougher. But after watching what you have accomplished these past 4 days, I think you are exactly the kind of people who could turn a rough world into home. He paused and chose his words carefully. This has to be your decision, yours and your people's. We can continue supporting the current setup and maybe you will be rescued eventually. Or you can change course and embrace a new mission and become the first humans to colonize a truly challenging world. Not because it was easy, but because you are capable of hard things. The response came back 12 hours later. Captain Morgan looked different somehow. Less like a military officer and more like a pioneer. She said they discussed the proposal. Spent 6 hours in the largest town hall meeting in human history. 2,000 people across 12 different modules, all connected by makeshift communications. You know what the vote was, she smiled. Unanimous. Not because we think it will be easy, because we have learned something about ourselves these past few days. We are not passengers waiting to be delivered to paradise. We are builders. We are survivors. We are humans, and humans do not need perfect conditions. We make conditions work for us, so yes, she continued. We are changing course. We are going to Kepler 442b, and we are going to build something amazing there. Not in spite of the challenges, but because of them. Because that is what Marcus Webb taught us. The best solutions do not come from perfect systems. They come from imperfect people working together. Morgan looked directly into the camera. When we get there and when we build our first settlement, we are naming it Webb City, after the man who saved us by reminding us that we could save ourselves. The success of the Horizon Initiative rescue sent shockwaves through Carter Technologies and beyond. Within days, every major news outlet was covering the story. But what fascinated Daniel most was how the story changed. Initially, the media framed it as Billionaire saves colony ship. Daniel hated that version. He held a press conference specifically to correct the record. He told the assembled reporters that he did not save anyone. The colonists saved themselves. Captain Morgan and her crew did the impossible through courage and creativity and cooperation. What we did from Earth was simply provide knowledge and support. He gestured to Marcus standing uncomfortably at the side of the stage. The real hero is Marcus Webb, a man whose brilliance was overlooked by every algorithm and hiring process in the corporate world, including mine. He saw solutions where everyone else, including me, saw only problems. He understood that the best answers often come from the bottom up, not the top down. A reporter called out asking if Daniel was saying his company's hiring practices were flawed. Daniel said absolutely without hesitation. We built systems that filter for credentials and pedigree and conventional success markers. In doing so, we missed someone like Marcus who had more practical wisdom than any 5 experts combined. That changes now. Over the following weeks, Daniel implemented sweeping changes at Carter Technologies. He dismantled the computer hiring filters and created human-led recruitment that valued diverse experience. He established consultation programs that brought in perspectives from outside traditional technology backgrounds, tradespeople and service workers and artists and educators. Most controversially, he restructured the company's decision-making process. Instead of the traditional setup where strategic choices flowed from the executive level down, he established councils where frontline employees had equal voices in major decisions. Greg Hammond warned him that he was going to lose control. You cannot run a corporation like a democracy. Daniel replied that he was not running it like a democracy. He was running it like a network. Like Marcus taught him, distributed power and backup systems and solutions that emerge from collaboration rather than command. Not everyone appreciated the changes. 3 board members resigned. Several high-level executives left for competitors. Stock prices initially dropped. The business media declared Daniel had lost his mind, but something interesting happened. Projects that had been stuck for months suddenly broke through. Engineering problems that had seemed impossible found elegant solutions from unexpected sources. A maintenance technician solved a computing stability issue that had puzzled researchers for years. A cafeteria worker redesigned the company's supply network, cutting costs by 30%. Marcus, despite Daniel's repeated offers of a permanent executive position, remained a consultant. He insisted he was not an executive. He was not even sure he was really a consultant. He was just someone who had learned that real wisdom comes from experience, especially experience with failure and difficulty. Daniel asked him to help create a program then. Something that brings that wisdom into the company in a structured way. Together, they developed the Webb Fellowship, a program that recruited talented individuals from non-traditional backgrounds, former military personnel and civil engineers from developing nations and experienced tradespeople, and community organizers, anyone with demonstrated practical problem-solving skills regardless of formal education. The first class of Webb Fellows included a former automotive mechanic and a refugee doctor whose credentials were not recognized in the United States, and a woman who spent 20 years managing supply chains for disaster relief and a retired firefighter. Marcus told Daniel as they reviewed the applications that these people were going to change everything. Not because they did not know the traditional ways, because they knew other ways, and sometimes the other way is the better way. The changes at Carter Technologies began to spread. Other companies inspired by the success story started implementing similar programs. Universities started valuing practical experience alongside academic achievement. Hiring practices across industries began to shift, looking for diverse perspectives rather than just impressive resumes. The change was slow and imperfect and often frustrating. Old systems and old thinking did not disappear overnight. But the seed had been planted. The idea that wisdom does not just flow downward from the top of organizations, but emerges from collaboration across all levels of experience and expertise. Marcus never became famous outside of industry circles. He never wanted to be. He continued his work quietly, consulting with companies and speaking at engineering conferences and always advocating for listening to the voices that traditional systems overlooked. 6 months after the Horizon Initiative changed course, Daniel received an unexpected visitor. Helen Price walked into his office without an appointment. She was the director of space operations for the Global Space Agency. Daniel knew her by reputation. Tough and smart and not someone who wasted time on social calls. She sat down across from his desk and got straight to the point. The agency was planning a new mission, a deep space exploration vessel that would travel farther than any human ship before. They wanted Daniel's company to build it, but more importantly, they wanted the web approach integrated into every aspect of the design and operation. Daniel asked what she meant by that. Helen leaned forward and said they wanted a ship designed not for perfection, but for resilience. Not for central control, but for distributed decision-making. Not for specialists, but for adaptable generalists. We have been building spacecraft the same way for 70 years, she explained. Top-down hierarchies and centralized systems and highly specialized crews. The Horizon Initiative proved there is a better way. We want to build the next generation of exploration vessels based on what Marcus Webb taught us. Daniel said he would need to talk to Marcus first. Helen smiled and said she already did. He is waiting in your conference room. Daniel found Marcus there looking at design proposals spread across the table. Marcus looked up and said this was interesting work. Real interesting. But he had some concerns. Daniel sat down and asked what kind of concerns. Marcus explained that the agency wanted to apply his principles, but they were still thinking in the old framework. They wanted redundancy, but they designed it from the top down. They wanted distributed decision-making, but they still had rigid command structures. What we need, Marcus said, is a ship where every system can function independently, but also connect to everything else. Where every crew member, regardless of rank, has the authority to solve problems in their area. Where the captain is not a commander, but a coordinator. Helen, who had followed them in, said that sounded like chaos. Marcus shook his head and said it sounded like how humans actually work best. He pulled up a diagram and started sketching modifications. Look here. You have the main bridge, but what if every section of the ship had its own control station? Not backup systems, but fully independent command centers. Any section could operate the entire ship if needed. You have specialists, but what if every specialist cross-trained in at least 3 other areas? You have protocols, but what if you built in the assumption that protocols would need to change? Helen studied the modifications and slowly nodded. This would require completely rethinking crew selection and training. Marcus agreed and said it would also require rethinking what kind of people they sent into space. Not just the smartest or the most credentialed, but the most adaptable. People who could think creatively under pressure. People who had experienced failure and learned from it. People like the colonists on the horizon who proved that survival was not about following plans, but about making new ones. Daniel watched as Marcus and Helen worked through the design challenges. He realized something important. Marcus was not just teaching them how to build better ships. He was teaching them how to think about complex problems differently. Not as puzzles with single correct answers, but as dynamic situations requiring constant adaptation. The meeting lasted 4 hours, and by the end they had the framework for something revolutionary. Helen left with a stack of proposals and a promise to return in 2 weeks with her team. After she was gone, Daniel asked Marcus if he realized what they had just started. Marcus smiled and said he had some idea. They were changing how humanity went to the stars, making it less about machines and more about people, less about control and more about trust. Daniel said he never imagined that night 6 months ago when Marcus walked into his office pushing a cleaning cart that it would lead to this. Marcus laughed and said neither did he. Life was funny that way. Sometimes the most important moments looked like nothing special at the time, just a janitor and a CEO talking about an impossible problem. But that conversation changed everything because someone was willing to listen and someone was willing to speak up. The Webb Initiative, as it became known, spread beyond aerospace. Medical centers started applying the principles to emergency response. Manufacturing plants redesigned production lines for resilience rather than efficiency. Schools restructured learning to value practical problem-solving alongside theoretical knowledge. Even government agencies began experimenting with distributed decision-making models. Not everyone embraced the changes. Critics argued that the approach was too chaotic and too risky, and too dependent on individual initiative. They said it worked for Carter Technologies because Daniel was willing to take chances, but most organizations could not afford that luxury. The criticism bothered Daniel at first, but Marcus told him to expect it. Change always met resistance, especially from people invested in the old ways. What matters, Marcus said, is not convincing everyone. What matters is proving it works. And they had proof. The Horizon Initiative survived against impossible odds. Carter Technologies became more innovative and more profitable. The new spacecraft design promised to be safer and more capable than anything that came before. The results spoke for themselves. A year after the crisis began, Daniel stood in front of a packed auditorium. 5,000 people from dozens of industries had gathered for the first Web Symposium, a conference dedicated to exploring new approaches to complex problems. Marcus had resisted the idea of a conference named after him, but Daniel insisted. The world needed to hear these ideas, and they needed to hear them from the source. Marcus took the stage to thunderous applause. He looked uncomfortable in his formal clothes, but his voice was steady as he began to speak. He thanked everyone for coming and said he hoped they would forgive an old janitor for taking up their time. The audience laughed and someone shouted that he was a hero. Marcus shook his head and said heroes were people who did impossible things. He just did common sense things that looked impossible because everyone had forgotten how he talked about his years in the Navy, learning that submarines survived not because they were perfect, but because every system had a backup and every sailor knew multiple jobs. He talked about construction projects in places where resources were scarce and creativity was essential. He talked about the moment in Daniel's office when he almost walked away without saying anything, because who listens to a janitor? But someone did listen, Marcus said. And that changed everything. Not because I had some special knowledge, because I had different knowledge. Experience that came from doing rather than studying. Wisdom that came from failure rather than success. And what I learned is that every person in every job has that kind of knowledge. The question is whether anyone is listening. He showed the Horizon Initiative footage, the desperate situation, the makeshift solutions, the triumph of human adaptability over technological failure. This is not a story about me, he said. This is a story about 2,000 people who refused to give up, who trusted each other and worked together and proved that humans do not need perfect systems. We just need each other. The symposium continued for 3 days. Engineers and teachers and doctors and business leaders shared ideas about applying Marcus's principles to their fields. A hospital administrator described restructuring emergency response to give nurses more authority. A factory manager explained how cross-training workers improved both safety and productivity. A teacher talked about redesigning curriculum to value practical problem-solving. On the final day, Daniel announced a new initiative. The Webb Foundation would provide funding and support for organizations implementing these approaches, not just in aerospace or technology, but in any field where complex problems required human solutions. The foundation would be led by Marcus and a board of advisors drawn from diverse backgrounds. Not the usual corporate executives and academics, but people with real-world experience in adaptation and survival. Marcus was reluctant to take the position, but Daniel convinced him. You have spent your whole life solving problems, Daniel said. Now you can help other people learn to solve theirs. Not by giving them answers, but by teaching them how to think differently. Marcus finally agreed, but insisted on one condition. The foundation would not just fund projects. It would listen to people who were usually ignored. The frontline workers and the community organizers and the people doing the actual work, because that is where the real wisdom lives. The foundation started small. A grant to a community health clinic testing new emergency response protocols. Support for a manufacturing cooperative experimenting with worker-led management. Funding for a school district redesigning technical education. Each project was different, but they all shared the same principle. Trust people to solve their own problems and give them the tools to do it. 6 months into the foundation's work, Daniel received a message from Captain Morgan. The Horizon Initiative had successfully entered orbit around Kepler 442b. They were preparing to send the first landing parties to the surface. The message included video of the planet. A blue-green world with higher mountains than Earth and thicker forests. The gravity was noticeably stronger and the atmosphere thinner, but it was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. Morgan spoke directly to the camera. 3 years ago, we thought we were going to die in the darkness of space. Today, we are about to set foot on a new world. Not the world we planned for, but maybe a better one. Because this world will be shaped by what Marcus Webb taught us. That strength comes not from perfection, but from resilience. That success comes not from following plans, but from adapting when plans fail. She paused and smiled. We are calling our first settlement Webb City as promised, but we are building it differently than any Earth city. No central power grid. Every building is independent but connected. No single government. Every neighborhood manages itself but coordinates with others. No rigid hierarchies. Every person, regardless of background, has a voice in decisions that affect them. We are building a society based on the principles that saved our lives. The message ended with a request. They wanted Marcus to come visit once regular transport was established. Not as a dignitary or a celebrity, but as a teacher, to help them think through problems as they arose. To remind them that the best solutions came from listening to each other. Marcus watched the message 3 times and then told Daniel he would go. Not right away, but eventually, when they needed him most. Meanwhile, on Earth, the changes continued to spread. Carter Technologies became known not just for innovation, but for its unique approach to problem solving. Other companies tried to copy the model with mixed results. Some succeeded by genuinely embracing the principles. Others failed by treating it as just another management fad. The difference, Marcus explained, was commitment. You could not pretend to value diverse perspectives while maintaining rigid hierarchies. You could not claim to trust people while micromanaging their work. The approach required genuine transformation. Daniel found himself invited to speak at business schools and leadership conferences. He always brought Marcus with him and always insisted that Marcus do most of the talking. At one prestigious university, a professor asked Marcus to describe his management philosophy in 1 sentence. Marcus thought for a moment and said, "Listen, more than you talk and trust more than you control." The professor looked disappointed, as if expecting something more complex. Marcus smiled and said, "Sometimes the simplest answers are the hardest to implement." 2 years after the crisis, Carter Technologies completed construction of the Explorer. The first spacecraft built entirely on Webb principles. It had no single bridge, but rather 7 independent command centers. No strict hierarchy, but rather a network of coordinators. No specialists, but rather cross-trained generalists. The crew of 60 had been selected not for their credentials, but for their adaptability. Former military personnel and emergency responders and people who had survived disasters, and anyone with demonstrated ability to think creatively under pressure. Helen Price commanded the ship, but she was careful to describe herself as first coordinator rather than captain. Her job was not to make decisions, but to facilitate them, to ensure information flowed freely and that every voice was heard and that solutions emerged from collaboration. The Explorer's mission was ambitious. A 5-year journey to survey 6 potentially habitable worlds, not to establish colonies, but to gather data for future missions. The launch was covered by media around the world. Daniel and Marcus watched from the control center as the Explorer lifted off. The ship performed perfectly, but more importantly, the crew performed perfectly. When a minor malfunction occurred during the 3rd stage burn, the engineering team fixed it without needing to contact ground control. When course corrections were needed, the navigation team made them collaboratively. Everything worked the way it was designed to work. Marcus turned to Daniel and said this was what success looked like. Not dramatic rescues or last-minute saves, but rather systems working the way they should. People trusted to do their jobs. Problems solved before they became crises. Daniel agreed and said they had come a long way from that night in his office. Marcus chuckled and said they still had a long way to go. Changing how humanity approached problems was the work of generations, not years. The Webb Foundation continued to grow and expand its reach. 3 years after its founding, it had supported over 200 projects in 30 countries. A water management system in a drought-stricken region that gave local farmers decision-making authority. An urban hospital that restructured emergency services around nurse-led teams. A tech startup that eliminated managers entirely in favor of self-organizing project groups. Each project taught them something new about what worked and what did not. Marcus spent increasing amounts of time traveling and consulting and teaching. He was in his late 60s now, and the work was tiring, but he said it was the most fulfilling thing he had ever done. He told Daniel during one of their regular meetings that he finally understood his purpose. All those years doing different jobs in different places, all that experience with broken systems and improvised solutions, it was all preparation for this moment, for helping others see that there was a better way. Daniel asked if Marcus ever regretted the years he spent as a janitor. If he resented the time that was wasted. Marcus shook his head firmly and said those years were not wasted. They taught him humility and patience and how to see things that important people missed. They also put him in Daniel's office that night. If he had been a high-level executive, he never would have been there pushing a cleaning cart. Never would have spoken up. The universe worked in strange ways. 4 years after the rescue, a message arrived from Webb City. The settlement was thriving. 5,000 people now lived on the surface of Kepler 442b. They had established sustainable agriculture and manufacturing, and even started mining operations. The higher gravity made everything harder, but also made them stronger. Children born there were growing up adapted to the conditions. Morgan reported that they faced challenges daily, but they faced them together. The distributed governance model was working better than anyone expected. She included a special message for Marcus. "We need you here," she said, "not to solve problems for us, but to help us think about the future. We are at a crossroads. Do we stay small and sustainable, or do we grow and risk the complications that come with growth? Do we maintain our current structure, or do we evolve it? We need your wisdom, not your answers. We need you to ask the questions we are not thinking to ask." Marcus watched the message and knew he had to go. Daniel arranged transportation on a cargo vessel making the 3-year journey. Marcus would be 70 when he arrived, but he was healthy and determined. He spent 6 months preparing, documenting everything he knew, training others to continue his work, making sure the foundation would thrive in his absence. Daniel tried to convince him to wait for faster transport, but Marcus insisted. They needed him now, not in 5 years when better ships were ready. The day Marcus left was emotional. Hundreds of people gathered to see him off. Former janitors and maintenance workers and service employees whose lives had been changed by his example. Corporate executives who had learned to listen. Engineers who had learned to think differently. Daniel stood with him at the boarding gate and struggled to find words. Marcus saved him the trouble by pulling him into a hug and saying thank you for listening. Daniel watched the ship depart and felt a profound sense of loss. Marcus had become more than a consultant or colleague. He was a friend and a teacher, and the person who had fundamentally changed how Daniel saw the world. But he also felt pride. Marcus was going where he was needed most, going to help build a new civilization based on principles of resilience and collaboration and trust, going to prove that the approach worked not just in emergencies but in everyday life. Carter Technologies continued to thrive in Marcus's absence. The culture he had helped create was now self-sustaining. New Webb Fellows arrived each year, bringing fresh perspectives. Projects continued to emerge from unexpected places. The company had become living proof that organizations could succeed by empowering people rather than controlling them. Other companies continued to study and imitate the model with increasing success. Daniel received regular messages from Marcus during the 3-year journey. Updates on life aboard the cargo vessel. Observations about the crew and how they worked together. Thoughts about what he hoped to accomplish on Kepler 442b. The messages were always brief but always insightful. Marcus had a way of seeing the essential truth in any situation and expressing it simply. When the cargo vessel finally entered orbit around Kepler 442b, the entire planet seemed to celebrate. Marcus descended to the surface in a shuttle and was met by Captain Morgan and a crowd of thousands. They had built a monument in the center of Webb City. Not a statue of Marcus, which he would have hated, but rather a sculpture representing interconnection. Thousands of metal threads woven together, each one fragile alone but together forming something unbreakable. Marcus spent the next 2 years on Kepler 442b working with the colonists. Not directing or commanding but facilitating, helping them think through challenges, asking questions they had not considered, encouraging them to trust their own wisdom. Under his gentle guidance, the settlement evolved its governance structure, created new systems for resource management, developed approaches to education that valued practical skills alongside theoretical knowledge. Everything worked because people were empowered to make it work. Back on Earth, Daniel continued the work. The Webb Foundation had become a major force for organizational change. The Webb Symposium was now an annual event attracting tens of thousands. The principles of distributed decision-making and practical wisdom were being taught in universities and business schools. What had started as a desperate attempt to save a dying spaceship had become a movement that changed how humanity organized itself. Daniel was in his office one evening when a priority message arrived from Kepler 442b. His heart sank fearing bad news. But when he opened it, he saw Marcus sitting in a garden. The older man looked at peace. He said he was recording this message to say goodbye, not because he was leaving, but because he was staying. "This is home now," he said. "These people need me and I need them. I have spent my whole life moving from place to place. I think I finally found where I belong. He continued, speaking directly to Daniel. Thank you for taking a chance on a janitor who spoke up when he probably should have kept quiet. Thank you for listening when you could have dismissed me. Thank you for understanding that wisdom comes from unexpected places. You changed my life that night. But more importantly, you changed how you saw the world. And that changed everything. Marcus smiled warmly. Keep doing what you are doing. Keep listening to people others ignore. Keep believing that the best solutions come from collaboration, not command. Keep proving that humans do not need perfect systems. We just need to trust each other. The message ended with Marcus looking up at the alien sky. A sky that was now his sky. A world that was now his home. Daniel watched the message 3 times before finally accepting that Marcus was not coming back. Part of him wanted to be sad about it, but mostly he felt gratitude. Marcus had given him more than solutions to problems. He had given him a new way of seeing. A new way of leading. A new way of being human. The lessons would continue long after Marcus was gone. 5 years after Marcus arrived on Kepler 442b, Daniel received another message. This one from Helen Price, who was now directing human expansion into deep space. She said they were planning something unprecedented. A network of settlements across multiple worlds, each independent but connected, each self-governing but coordinated. A human civilization built on web principles from the ground up. They wanted Carter Technologies to be part of it, wanted the Web Foundation to help design the social structures, wanted everything they had learned to shape humanity's future among the stars. Daniel assembled his team to discuss the proposal. Not just executives, but people from every level of the company, maintenance workers and administrative assistants and line technicians alongside engineers and managers. They spent 3 days working through the implications. The challenges were enormous. The opportunities were staggering. In the end, they voted unanimously to participate. Not because it would be easy, but because it was important. Because it was the kind of challenge that Marcus taught them to embrace. Work began on what they called the Network Initiative. 15 worlds identified as suitable for settlement. Ships being designed to carry not just colonists, but complete ecosystems. Social structures planned around distributed governance and practical wisdom. Every aspect of the project reflected lessons learned from the Horizon Initiative and from Marcus's teachings. This was humanity's chance to start fresh, to build civilization without the rigid hierarchies and centralized control that Earth had developed over millennia. Daniel was 70 years old when the first wave of Network Initiative ships launched. He stood with Helen watching as 12 vessels lifted off simultaneously from launch sites around the world. Each carried 5,000 people. Each was headed to a different world. Each was a test of whether humans could truly organize themselves differently. Whether the web approach worked not just in crisis but in building lasting societies. Over the following decade, messages came back from the settlements. Some succeeded spectacularly, creating thriving communities where every voice mattered and every person contributed. Others struggled, learning that empowerment required responsibility and that freedom required discipline. A few failed entirely, collapsing into chaos when people could not agree on basic principles. Each outcome taught the others something valuable. The network learned from both successes and failures. Web City remained the jewel of human settlement. Now home to 50,000 people, it had become a model that others studied. Captain Morgan, who now went by Governor Morgan, though she disliked the title, sent regular updates. They had terraformed significant portions of the planet, established trade with other settlements, created art and culture unique to their world. Most importantly, they had proven that a society built on trust and collaboration could not just survive but flourish. Marcus remained there until the end. He passed away at age 82, surrounded by people who loved him, people whose lives he had saved, people whose civilization he had helped shape. The funeral was attended by thousands, not just from Kepler 442b, but from Earth and from every settlement in the network. They came to honor not a hero or a leader, but a teacher, someone who reminded them that wisdom lives in every person and that the best solutions emerge when everyone is heard. Daniel received the news of Marcus's death while working late in his office. The same office where they had first met all those years ago. He sat in the darkness for a long time thinking about that night. About a janitor who spoke up and a CEO who listened. About how one conversation had changed everything. About how the ripples from that moment continued to spread across human civilization. He thought about what Marcus would want him to do now. The answer was obvious. Keep working. Keep listening. Keep teaching others to see what he had learned to see. That every person has value. That every voice deserves to be heard. That the best organizations trust people rather than control them. That humanity's strength lies not in perfection, but in our ability to adapt and collaborate and survive together. Carter Technologies continued for another generation under new leadership. The Webb Foundation expanded to support settlements throughout the network. The principles that Marcus taught became foundational to human civilization among the stars. Not because they were imposed from above, but because they worked. Because people living under those principles created better lives for themselves. 100 years after that night in the office, a historian came to interview Daniel. He was 95 and his memory was failing, but he remembered that night perfectly. The historian asked what made Marcus Webb so special. What gave him the insight that saved the Horizon Initiative and changed human civilization? Daniel thought for a long time before answering. He said Marcus was not special in the way people usually mean. He was not a genius or a visionary. He was just someone who had lived enough life to understand that people are resourceful and resilient. That given trust and tools and freedom, people will solve their own problems. That the role of leaders is not to have all the answers, but to create conditions where answers can emerge. These were not complicated ideas. They were simple truths that everyone knew deep down, but that society had forgotten. The historian asked what Daniel considered Marcus's greatest achievement. Daniel smiled and said it was not saving the Horizon Initiative, though that was remarkable. It was not founding the Webb Foundation or influencing the Network Initiative or any of the visible accomplishments. Marcus's greatest achievement was changing how one billionaire CEO thought about people. Because that CEO went on to change a company, which influenced an industry which helped reshape human civilization. The ripples from one conversation spread further than anyone could have imagined. The interview ended and the historian left. Daniel sat alone in his study looking at a photograph on the wall. It showed Marcus in his janitor's uniform standing next to Daniel in his expensive suit. Both were smiling. They had taken it the day after solving the Horizon crisis, before either of them knew what would come next. Before the Webb Initiative or the Webb Foundation or any of it. Just two men who had worked together through the night to save lives. Daniel passed away 6 months later. At his funeral, people from around the world and across the network gathered to pay respects. They told stories about his generosity and his vision and his leadership. But the story that mattered most was the simplest one. The story of a powerful man who listened to a janitor, who set aside ego and hierarchy and conventional wisdom to hear what someone else had to say, who proved that wisdom can come from anywhere if you are willing to listen. On Kepler 442b in the center of Webb City, the monument still stood. Thousands of metal threads woven together, fragile alone but unbreakable together. Around it, the civilization that Marcus helped build continued to grow. Children played in gardens their grandparents had planted. Workers collaborated in factories with no managers. Councils met where every voice carried equal weight. Problems arose and people solved them. Challenges emerged and communities adapted. Life went on in the way Marcus always said it should. Imperfect but resilient. Chaotic but functional. Human. And sometimes late at night when the settlement was quiet, an elderly woman who had been a child on the Horizon Initiative would walk to the monument. She would touch the woven metal and remember the panic of those desperate days. Remember the moment hope returned. Remember the message from Earth that saved their lives. Remember the principle that Marcus Webb taught them and that they had built a world upon. That humans do not need perfect systems. They do not need flawless plans or brilliant leaders or ideal conditions. They need each other. They need trust. They need the freedom to adapt and improvise and solve problems together. They need to remember that wisdom lives in every person, and that the best solutions emerge when everyone contributes. They need to listen more than they speak and trust more than they control. This was the lesson of Marcus Webb, a black janitor who told a billionaire CEO the answer and showed him what others could not see. That value does not come from titles or credentials or wealth. That insight does not flow only from the top down. That the person pushing a cleaning cart might just save your life if you are humble enough to listen. That humanity's future belongs not to those who claim to have all the answers, but to those who know how to find answers in each other. The universe turned, stars burned, worlds spun, And across a network of settlements scattered through the cosmos, humans lived according to principles taught by a janitor who spoke up when he could have stayed silent, who shared wisdom when he could have remained invisible, who proved that one voice can change everything if someone is willing to hear it. The story of Marcus Webb and Daniel Carter became legend, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Not because it was complicated, but because it was simple. Two men meeting by chance. One speaking, one listening, and everything that followed.